actually got my first job while I was still in college. I was a YES ambassador, which was the Youth Engaged in Service ambassador. It was a program through the Points of Light Foundation. So you did almost a one-year fellowship with them, focused on youth service, service learning, and trying to build that curriculum in your state. And that position itself was housed at the Michigan Community Service Commission. And so I was there for a little while under Diana Algra before she made her transition to Washington, D.C. To be helpful with the AmeriCorps program expansion. And so I was there and along with Kyle Caldwell, who was also there as a GMI intern, I think they were called. And we were actually part of my year at the Community Service Commission included helping start up the first Governor Service Awards. And then I also, along with Kyle and others, implemented the first year of AmeriCorps. So we developed all the regulations for the state, did a lot of work, obviously, in Washington, D.C. as the program was being developed. But that was my first kind of involvement with national service, along with the infrastructure here in Michigan, was at the Community Service Commission. After that, a year after that, during that program ended, obviously, after a year, and then I was picked up by the Volunteer Centers of Michigan. They hired me to be their executive director, and at that time, the Volunteer Centers of Michigan was housed at the Michigan Nonprofit Forum, and Dave Egner was its new executive director at that time, and he hired me to, along with the Volunteer Centers, to run the Volunteer Centers of Michigan. So I did that for 3 years and then expanded that role to president and CEO after Dave had left the organization. So my parents both immigrated to this country in the 1960s. My brother and I were born and raised in Livonia, Michigan. So, you know, they came from a country, obviously a large democracy. Their families were involved in India, in politics and so forth. And so, you know, for me, kind of the conversations around the kitchen table and so forth were always about, you know, the big issues facing a community, facing your state, facing your country. And so we would talk about those things. They've never really understood nonprofit organizations. I know it was a struggle when I tried to explain my first job, why I was doing that, and so there wasn't a strong background because they came from a country where there were NGOs, but they weren't as prevailing as they are in this country. And so it was kind of an area that, you know, I think they were learning on. But the values that they taught us as immigrants about giving back to the country that you know, provided this opportunity, about being involved in your community because that's what's expected, was something both me and my brother took on. And my brother ended up, you know, being executive director of a nonprofit organization and doing a lot with community building in Detroit. You know, my path took me to mostly statewide nonprofit organizations, but it's specifically that kind of commitment to public service that they had, you know, instilled in both of us that kind of led us on that pathway. But I do remember that conversation. They said, nonprofit, do they pay you, you know? And the common thing you hear from people sometimes when they don't understand the sector, but that was something they were, you know, I think over time they became very comfortable with it. But they were very, you know, confused with, you know, that there were jobs there and so forth. So not only was I trying to explain nonprofits to the world, I was explaining them to my parents as well. My first involvement with kind of the leadership type of camps was at Camp Minnewanka. So that would have been in '93, so it might have been maybe the second or third year. But that was during that year I was in the Youth Engaged in Service Ambassador Program. That's how I got connected to the Council of Michigan Foundations and most specifically the McFIP program. I was kind of doing work as trying to create the youth voice for some of the youth action councils across the state. So I worked with a number of local youth action councils, but then also was brought in to do some training along with the Michigan Campus Compact and a few other organizations. Well, it was actually a very exciting period of time. I mean, both for, I think, the movement, but also for a group of us who were just graduating from college at the time. I'd started my involvement at the Service Learning Center at Michigan State University's campus. So I was getting very actively involved, and to be then involved with these statewide associations that were doing cutting-edge things for the country at the time, and then given the responsibility that we were given, whether it was a woman by the name of Jeannie Gray, who was at the Michigan Campus Compact, Jill Mason, who was with the Council of Michigan Foundations, Terry Langston. There was a group of 4 or 5 of us that were really young professionals, and as they were doing these national changes to creating the AmeriCorps program, for example, a National Youth Service Day, we were actually the ones that were charged to implement them. And so to be given that level of responsibility right out of college, I think was really exciting for us as professionals, but it really had that youth feel to it because we were really trying to get younger people involved in the decision making. Yeah, there's actually some very specific moments in college. As I was working with a group called Into the Streets, and that was started by the group called COOL, the Campus Opportunity Outreach League. And it was that period of time in the early 90s and late 80s where, you know, this me generation was being really talked about, that, you know, my age, my cohorts really only cared about themselves. And, you know, there was a group of college presidents nationally who said, that's not the people, you know, that we know on our campuses, that we want to change that kind of image. And so they were really talking about service and service learning. And so I got really involved with that. You know, I specifically went to Camp Minnewanka as a college student to talk about what we could do to transform service. And I remember specifically being there. I still stay in touch with some of the advisors that I met there about service learning and what you could do in local communities. And then I still was on a pathway to get my my law degree, and that was what I was still thinking. But then I ended up doing an alternative break program. It was right after Homestead and the Hurricane Andrew that had gone through that period of time. And there was a group of 50 of us from Michigan State University who went down and specifically worked on a number of homes. And the family I worked with was just an amazing family. They were rebuilding, you know, their home. But the father would still volunteer with a couple people down the street that were a little bit older and needed some more help. And so it was really strange for me because I'm like, you had this devastation happen to you, you're still rebuilding your home. But I remember the conversations that I had with him and about how he said because he had so much still with his health and his family being safe, that he felt he still had to help others. And I think it was, you know, a combination of those types of experiences on the campus that I decided I wasn't going to go the law degree route. I was going to work for nonprofit organizations, and I've never regretted that choice from that point forward. I was very young. I was, I think, selected. I was 26 at the time, and I remember very vividly how that whole process kind of unfolded. And Rick Cole was the chairman of the Michigan Nonprofit Association board at the time. David Seaman, who was with the Hospital Association, was the chair of the search committee. And they did a national search and found, I think, some candidates to interview. And in the end, I think they said, there's this young guy, you know, at the association who doesn't have a lot of experience, but if we gave him the right mentoring and so forth, he would be just as, you know, maybe good as these national candidates. And, you know, it probably took a lot of courage to say, okay, we're going to take this institution and give it to a 26-year-old. But it was a great opportunity for me personally, and because of the quality of the board of directors that we had, we were able to do amazing things. You know, we quickly grew that organization. When I left it, it was 1,100 members. I think when I started, we were around 300 members. You know, we grew staff. We obviously had a number of those mergers that happened. We were able to create the Connect Michigan Alliance. And so I'm always grateful to that board of directors to, you know, taking a chance with a fairly young person to be able to lead that organization. I got elected to the city council at 24, and then I became mayor. I think I was 34.
Oh, okay.
And so I was a little bit older, but it's still the youngest mayor in at that time in the city's history. But again, I took the nonprofit elements that I learned. You know, it was about how do you build the right coalition? How do you bring people, you know? So at the age of 24, when, you know, you're just right out of college, you know, there's a lot of people who are skeptical that, you know, you should be making decisions for their community. But I use that kind of thinking that I learned from nonprofits as to build not only a campaign structure, but once I got elected, to really talk about the issues. And I spent 12 years in local government, and representing a university community was a great thing for me, because it was a community that was willing to invest. It was a community that appreciated volunteering and appreciated nonprofit organizations. So I was able to do that at the same time of my other nonprofit passions, and so it was a great fit.